You're seated at a banquet in the 1300s, stomach growling. You lift the lid, expecting a feast of roasted meats and rich pies. Instead, you're faced with tree bark, insects, or maybe a steaming pot of bone broth made from bones dug up from a graveyard. Welcome to a medieval famine. When crops failed, people didn't just go hungry. They got disturbingly creative. Medieval Europe was a place of fragile food security. For the average people, getting food was a daily challenge. A bad season could leave them scouring forests for anything to eat. Therefore, food was more than just sustenance. It was a form of wealth. When famine struck, such as during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, the price of grain and meat skyrocketed. During these times, wealth was measured in loaves of bread, and grain became so valuable that people sold their land, livestock, and even household goods just to secure enough food to survive. And when grain ran out, the situation became desperate. As the famine grew worse, even animals once seen as pests became valuable food sources. Rats, mice, and other vermin were suddenly on the menu. Now, before you gag, let's take a moment to appreciate the resourcefulness of medieval people. In cities where food was scarce, rats were an easy target. They were plentiful, easy to catch, and most importantly, meat. And in times of famine, any meat was good meat. During the Great Famine, there are records of people in urban areas hunting rats and mice to survive. Chronicles from Paris even mention citizens scouring alleyways for vermin. Think of it as the medieval version of fast food, just a little more agile. And here's a fun twist. Rats weren't necessarily seen as unclean animals in some medieval societies, particularly before the widespread association of rats with disease, like during the Black Death. In fact, medieval medical texts occasionally recommended consuming them as a treatment for illnesses. While the thought of rat stew might make our modern stomachs turn, for many, it was a lifeline. Think of it this way. If you've ever had to chase a rat around your kitchen, you know they make for quite the workout too. Now, as uncomfortable as it gets, we have to talk about cannibalism. While not common, there are historical accounts of desperate people turning to cannibalism in times of extreme famine. This was particularly the case during prolonged famines, where all other food sources had been exhausted. During the Great Famine, there were reports of people eating not only the flesh of the dead, but also, horrifically, the flesh of children. In 1315, Bristol's city chronicles noted a famine so severe that the living could barely bury the dead, with horse flesh, dog flesh, and even children being eaten. As if that wasn't grim enough, there are accounts of individuals digging up freshly buried bodies to consume. It's hard to imagine, but this really shows just how dire things became. Thankfully, these stories were rare, but they serve as a stark reminder of how desperate people became when faced with the possibility of death by starvation. At this point, I'd like to remind everyone that no matter how bad your meal prep skills are, at least you're not making neighbor stew or graveyard stew for dinner. While we can joke about it now, this was the reality for some medieval people. Cannibalism wasn't just a horror story told by the fire. Back then, it was a last resort when no other options remained. And hey, if you're just relieved you're not living in the Middle Ages, don't forget to subscribe to Binge History. Hit that bell icon to stay notified whenever we drop a new video. Unlike the rich meat pies we imagine from medieval feasts, famine pies were, well, a bit more creative. These pies were filled with whatever could be scavenged. Roots, wild onions, birds, small animals, and yes, even insects. Anything remotely edible went into these pies. In some cases, if livestock or animals had recently died of disease due to the harsh conditions, their meat could also be used. In fact, some chronicles even describe entire villages coming together to pool ingredients and bake enough pies to survive another day. These pies became a communal lifeline, where no ingredient was too strange or too small to contribute. And in a strange twist, while pigeon pies later gained fame as a delicacy, For famine-ridden peasants, these were far from gourmet. It's like that time you tried to make a fridge-cleaning meal, only your ingredients are the things you'd normally call an exterminator for. So, next time you're complaining about nothing in the fridge, just remember, you could be eating rats and silkworms. But as strange as these famine foods were, the scarcity of food also deepened social inequality. During the Great Famine, prices for essentials like grain rose steeply. In England, the price of a quarter barrel of wheat increased from 5 shillings to 40 shillings, and in Lorraine, wheat prices soared by 320%, making bread unaffordable for peasants. Meanwhile, wealthier families hoarded grain or bought it at inflated prices, while the poor starved. Even local authorities like King Edward II tried to control the crisis by setting price ceilings on grain, but these efforts largely failed. Riots and rebellions erupted where people couldn't endure the hardship anymore. For many, having bread was a matter of life and death. With no grain left, desperation forced people to eat whatever they could find or afford. In some cases, this led to entire communities collapsing or migrating in search of sustenance. Now, let's talk about something you might actually recognize from your backyard: grass. Wild plants like nettles, dandelions, and thistles became staples in the diet of the poor. Before you imagine medieval folks happily munching on a fresh green salad, think again. These plants weren't exactly gourmet. Many of them were bitter, tough, and, if prepared incorrectly, could be poisonous. Nettles, for example, required boiling to neutralize their stinging hairs, while celandine could cause liver damage if not properly handled. But when your only other option is starving to death, suddenly, that patch of weeds starts to look appetizing. To make these wild greens edible, they were often boiled, sometimes for hours, in hopes of making them less bitter. Nutritionally, they weren't too bad. In fact, wild plants like nettles are packed with essential nutrients that were lacking during periods of food scarcity. But they weren't exactly filling. Medieval chroniclers often wrote about people turning to plants they would never eat in normal times, as these plants were usually reserved for livestock. Farm to table took on a whole new meaning. If grass wasn't doing the trick, people would turn to another unlikely source of sustenance: trees. Specifically, they would strip the inner bark from trees like birch, pine, or elm, grind it into a powder, and mix it with whatever little flour they had left to create something called bark bread. Now, calling it bread is generous. It was dry, tough, and tasted about as good as you'd imagine bread made from tree bark would taste. But in times of famine, this bread provided some much-needed calories. The practice of making bark bread wasn't limited to medieval Europe either. It was also used by Scandinavians during times of famine and by indigenous peoples in various parts of the world. Bark bread, despite its toughness, could sustain people for weeks, though it lacked the vital nutrients found in real grain bread. And it wasn't just bark. People also made tree soup, a broth made by boiling the inner bark of trees to extract any trace of nutrients. Interestingly, this idea wasn't as outlandish as it might seem today. Many traditional cultures, even outside of Europe, recognized the inner bark of trees as having medicinal properties. So next time you complain about your bread being too stale, remember that medieval peasants were out here eating trees. If you're grateful you weren't born in the Middle Ages, hit that subscribe button and click the bell. Because trust me, history gets even wilder from here on Binge History.